Most people thought the homeless boy sleeping in the Boston Public Library was hiding from the cold, but the truth was far stranger. Every single night, he was secretly teaching himself how to save human lives. Snow drifted slowly past the tall glass windows of the library, soft white flakes melting against the yellow glow spilling onto Tremont Street. Inside, the building was almost silent now. A distant heater rattled somewhere in the walls. Pages turned softly. Computer screens blinked in the darkness like tiny stars. At exactly 1:47 a.m., the security guard made his usual round through the East Wing. History section, empty. Fiction aisle, empty. Study hall, empty. He yawned, adjusting the flashlight on his belt as he passed table 14 near the back corner of the neuroscience shelves. Then he stopped. A backpack sat beneath the table. Old, torn, one zipper hanging loose by a thread. Kid, the guard muttered quietly. No answer. He crouched lower and froze. A teenage boy lay curled beneath the wooden table, one arm wrapped protectively around a thick anatomy textbook nearly the size of his chest. The boy couldn't have been older than 17. His gray hoodie was damp around the sleeves from melted snow. His sneakers were split near the soles. One sock didn't even match the other. But that wasn't what caught the guard's attention. It was the notebook beside him. Every inch of it was filled with handwritten medical notes, diagrams of the human brain, surgical terminology, arrows, definitions. Entire pages copied from advanced neuroscience textbooks most college students struggled to understand. The boy's fingers twitched slightly in his sleep, still clutching a dull yellow pencil. A faint streak of dried blood marked the edge of one page where his cracked knuckles had split from the cold. The guard stared another second before exhaling softly. Jesus, he whispered. Footsteps approached from the far aisle. Margaret Hale appeared carrying a stack of returned books against her chest. 52 years old, silver strands tucked into a loose bun, wire-frame glasses sliding down her nose. She noticed the guard standing still. What is it? She asked quietly. He stepped aside without speaking. Margaret looked down beneath the table. Her expression changed instantly. Not fear. Not annoyance. Recognition. The kind that comes from seeing loneliness too many times before. The boy shifted slightly in his sleep, tightening his arm around the anatomy book like someone afraid it might disappear if he let go. Margaret carefully picked up the notebook beside him. Her eyes scanned the pages. Neurovascular pathways, brainstem anatomy, emergency response procedures. Precise, detailed, obsessive. One page had a sentence written over and over again in cramped handwriting. You were born to save people. Margaret swallowed slowly. What do we do? The guard asked under his breath. She remained silent for a long moment, staring at the exhausted teenager sleeping on the library floor beneath fluorescent lights. Outside, the snowstorm thickened, covering the city in white silence. Margaret slowly removed her cardigan sweater and folded it beside the sleeping boy. Then she turned off the nearest overhead light. Nothing, she whispered softly. We do absolutely nothing. The guard frowned. Margaret, policy says. I know what policy says. Her voice stayed calm. Tired. Human. She looked down once more at the teenager whose cheek rested against a page labeled cranial nerves. But that boy isn't here to steal, she said quietly. He's here because this is the only place in the city where nobody tells him he doesn't belong. The next night, Ethan arrived 23 minutes before closing time with snow still clinging to the shoulders of his hoodie. He moved quietly through the library like someone afraid the building might suddenly decide it no longer wanted him there. His backpack looked heavier tonight. The strap had been tied together with a shoelace after tearing loose sometime during the week. Margaret noticed him immediately from the front desk, though she pretended not to. Ethan always followed the same routine. He entered without speaking, nodded once at the security guard, walked straight toward the neuroscience aisle. Then he disappeared behind table 14 until the world outside stopped existing. Margaret watched him from across the room while stamping returned books. There was something unusual about the way he studied. Most students skimmed pages. Ethan devoured them. His eyes moved quickly, absorbing entire paragraphs with frightening focus. Sometimes his lips moved silently, as if repeating definitions to himself. Sometimes he traced diagrams in the air with his finger like he was memorizing invisible maps. And every 40 minutes exactly, he flexed his hands because the cold made his fingers stiff. At 11:18 p.m., Margaret walked slowly toward his table carrying a cart of books she did not actually need to organize. Ethan looked up instantly, startled. For a second, pure panic crossed his face, like he expected her to finally tell him to leave. Margaret glanced down at the open textbook in front of him. Neuroanatomy, she asked softly. Ethan hesitated before nodding once. Yes, ma'am. His voice was rough from exhaustion. Margaret picked up one of his notebooks carefully. Every page was packed with handwritten notes in tiny lettering. Medical terminology, brain structures, emergency treatment protocols, entire definitions copied word for word. Where are you learning all this? She asked. Ethan looked down at the table. Books. No classes. Could not afford them. Margaret studied him another moment. The heater above them rattled loudly before falling silent again. Ethan quickly pulled his sleeves over his hands to hide the redness in his knuckles. Margaret noticed anyway. How old are you? 17. And you understand all this? Ethan shrugged slightly. Most of it. Then after a pause, I still struggle with vascular pathways. Margaret almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it sounded exactly like something a first-year medical student would say. A loud winter wind pushed against the library windows, making the glass tremble softly. Ethan instinctively glanced outside. Snow was falling harder now. Boston looked frozen solid beyond the streetlights. Margaret lowered her voice. Do you have somewhere warm to sleep tonight? Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. I am fine. The answer came too fast. Too practiced. Margaret knew that tone. It was the sound people made when life had taught them accepting help came with consequences. She nodded gently, pretending to accept it. Then she reached into her cardigan pocket and slid something onto the table beside him. A wrapped turkey sandwich from the cafe downstairs. Ethan stared at it silently. They were going to throw it away, Margaret said casually. Seems like a waste. Ethan looked at the sandwich for several long seconds before speaking. Thank you. 2 simple words. Quiet enough to disappear beneath the sound of falling snow. Margaret turned to leave, but stopped halfway down the aisle when she heard him suddenly ask, Can I ask you something? She looked back. Ethan swallowed hard before speaking. How late can someone stay here before they get banned? Margaret felt something twist painfully inside her chest. She glanced toward the dark windows. Then back at the exhausted teenager sitting beneath fluorescent lights with a neuroscience textbook open in front of him like it was the only thing keeping him alive. As long as they are chasing something important, she said softly, I think they deserve a little more time. Over the next 3 weeks, the library became the closest thing Ethan had to a home. Not because it was warm. The heating system barely worked near the East Wing anyway. Not because it was comfortable. The wooden chairs left his back aching every night. But because for the first time in years, nobody looked at him like he was already lost. Every evening, just before sunset, Ethan crossed the city carrying the same worn backpack over one shoulder. Some nights his clothes smelled faintly like fryer grease from the diner where he washed dishes until closing. Other nights his jeans were damp from freezing rain after sleeping beneath the train overpass near South Station. Still, no matter how exhausted he was, he always showed up. Margaret began noticing the details little by little. Ethan never wasted electricity charging his phone because the phone no longer worked. He copied entire textbook chapters by hand because he could not afford photocopies. He drank water slowly to trick his stomach into thinking he had eaten. And every single night, before opening his notebook, he carefully placed an old photograph beside his books. One evening, Margaret caught a glimpse of it while shelving returns nearby. A woman in a hospital gown smiling weakly at the camera. Her arm wrapped around a much younger Ethan. The corners of the photo were bent from being handled too often. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were 4 words. My brave boy. Keep going. Margaret quietly looked away before he noticed. At 12:26 a.m., Ethan sat cross-legged beneath table 14, reviewing cranial nerve pathways, while snow tapped softly against the windows. His pencil paused suddenly when a fresh book slid onto the table beside him. Ethan looked up. Margaret stood there holding a small stack against her chest. Advanced Clinical Neuroscience, she said softly. It was being removed from storage. Ethan stared at the hardcover book like someone had handed him gold. This costs over $200, he whispered. Not anymore, Margaret replied. The cover is damaged. Ethan carefully touched the worn spine with both hands. His fingers almost trembled. Thank you. Margaret noticed how gently he handled books. like sacred objects, like doors. She sat across from him for the first time. You memorize very fast, she said. Ethan shrugged slightly. I have to. Why? Silence settled between them. Somewhere in the distance, a printer hummed. Ethan stared down at the photograph beside his notebook. My mother died waiting in an emergency room. His voice stayed calm, but his fingers tightened around the pencil. There were too many patients. Not enough doctors. Margaret did not interrupt. Ethan swallowed once before continuing. I remember watching people walk past us. Nurses. Residents. Everybody busy. Nobody cruel. Just busy. He looked toward the dark library windows. I kept thinking, if somebody understood her scans faster, maybe she would still be here. Margaret felt her chest tighten painfully. Ethan rarely spoke about himself. But once the words started, they came quietly, like water slipping through cracks. After she died, my dad stopped trying. He forced a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. I guess. I started trying enough for both of us. Margaret looked at the exhausted 17-year-old sitting beneath fluorescent lights, studying medical textbooks, past midnight, while the rest of the city slept. Most people would have seen a homeless kid. A runaway. Another statistic. But sitting there across from him now, she saw something else entirely. Someone carrying grief so heavy it had turned into purpose. Ethan looked back down at the neuroscience book in front of him. Do you think somebody like me can actually become a doctor? He asked quietly. Margaret answered without hesitation. I think somebody like you already decided. By February, the staff stopped pretending they did not know Ethan lived between the cracks of the city. The morning janitor left extra creamers beside the coffee machine without saying a word. One security guard started unlocking the side restroom 10 minutes early so Ethan could wash his face before the after-school crowd arrived. Nobody discussed it openly. The library simply adjusted itself around him, quietly, the way people do when kindness becomes routine. But survival still came one day at a time. Every morning at 5:30, Ethan woke beneath the train overpass wrapped in 2 donated blankets that smelled faintly like detergent and rainwater. He folded them carefully before the city stirred awake around him. Then he walked 11 blocks to a 24-hour gym downtown, where he showered using a membership card someone at the diner had secretly kept active for him after he could no longer pay. By 7 a.m., he was washing dishes in the back kitchen of Murray's Grill, while cooks shouted breakfast orders over the sound of sizzling bacon and clattering pans. Grease coated the air. Steam soaked through his hoodie sleeves. Some days he worked until his wrists cramped so badly he could barely hold a pencil later that night. Still, every evening, he returned to the library. Margaret began setting aside books she thought might help him. Biology journals, old medical exam prep guides, even outdated hospital training manuals the university had donated years earlier. Ethan read every page like his life depended on it. Maybe it did. One freezing Thursday night, Margaret found him asleep again beneath table 14 around closing time. This time his notebook remained open beside him. She glanced down and noticed dozens of tiny handwritten flashcards scattered across the floor. Symptoms, diagnoses, emergency response steps. Ethan had been studying while fighting sleep until exhaustion finally won. Margaret bent down carefully to gather the cards before they blew beneath the shelves. One card stopped her cold. Brain aneurysm symptoms in women. Underneath it, Ethan had written in darker ink, "Do not miss what happened to Mom." Margaret slowly sat beside the table, staring at the words while the library lights dimmed automatically around them. She suddenly understood something painful. Ethan was not studying medicine because he loved science. He was studying because grief had convinced him knowledge was the only thing stronger than helplessness. Ethan stirred awake a moment later, immediately embarrassed. "I am sorry," he said quickly, sitting up. "I did not mean to fall asleep." Margaret handed him the flashcards. "How long have you been teaching yourself all this?" Ethan rubbed his eyes tiredly. "About 4 years. For years." He nodded once. "Started with library computers after school." A faint smile crossed his face. "At first I did not understand half the words. And now?" Ethan looked down at the stack of cards in his hands. "Now I understand enough to know how much I still do not know." Margaret almost laughed softly at that. It sounded exactly like something a real physician would say. Outside, freezing rain tapped against the windows while the city blurred silver beneath streetlights. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret looked at him. "Why are you helping me?" The question hung quietly between them. Honest. Vulnerable. Margaret folded her hands together slowly. Because when my younger brother was your age, she said softly, nobody noticed he was drowning until it was too late. Ethan remained still. Margaret rarely spoke about her family. People think saving someone always looks dramatic, she continued quietly. But sometimes it is just remembering their name. Sometimes it is leaving a sandwich on a table. Sometimes it is choosing not to look away. Ethan stared at her silently. For the first time in years, the tightness in his chest eased just enough for him to breathe differently. Not safe exactly, but maybe seen. The storm arrived just after midnight. Freezing rain hammered against the tall library windows hard enough to rattle the glass, and the streets outside emptied beneath flashing traffic lights and sheets of silver water. Most of the staff had already gone home early, leaving only Margaret, one security guard, and a handful of students buried behind laptops during finals week. Ethan barely noticed the weather. He sat beneath the soft pool of light at table 14 with 3 open textbooks surrounding him like walls. One notebook held detailed sketches of the human brain. Another was packed with handwritten emergency procedures copied from an old trauma medicine guide Margaret had found in storage. His hood was still damp from the walk across town. At 12:41 a.m., the elevator near the research wing opened suddenly. A tall man in his 60s stepped out holding a leather briefcase against his side while speaking into a phone. Gray wool coat. Expensive shoes. The kind of sharp posture that made people instinctively move aside. Margaret recognized him immediately. Dr. Richard Bennett, chairman of neurosurgery at St. Vincent Medical Center, one of the most respected surgeons in Massachusetts. He occasionally visited the library archives for research journals. Tonight, he looked exhausted. No, reschedule the lecture, he said sharply into the phone while walking past the study tables. I said next Thursday, not tomorrow morning. His sentence stopped abruptly. The phone slipped from his hand and hit the carpet. Ethan looked up instantly. Dr. Bennett grabbed the edge of a nearby table, disoriented. His breathing changed. One side of his face tightened strangely. A student gasped nearby. Sir, Margaret called out, stepping forward quickly. Dr. Bennett collapsed into a chair, blinking hard like the room suddenly tilted sideways. Panic spread almost immediately. Someone shouted to call 911. Another student froze completely, phone trembling in her hand. Ethan was already moving. He reached Dr. Bennett first, dropping to one knee beside him. Sir, can you hear me? Dr. Bennett tried to answer, but his speech came out slurred and uneven. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Focused. Sharp. He glanced at the doctor's uneven pupils. The trembling hand. The confusion. Then at the clock on the wall. Possible hemorrhagic stroke, he said firmly. The room fell silent. Margaret stared at him. Ethan turned toward the terrified student holding the phone. Tell the dispatcher his symptoms started less than 2 minutes ago. Possible intracranial bleed. Tell them he needs immediate stroke response. His voice stayed calm despite the pounding rain outside. Keep him sitting upright. Do not let him fall asleep. The student repeated every word shakily into the phone. Dr. Bennett groaned softly, clutching his head. Ethan carefully loosened the doctor's scarf to help his breathing while checking his pulse exactly the way he had practiced hundreds of times inside medical textbooks. Margaret watched in stunned silence. This was no longer a homeless teenager studying alone in a library. This was instinct. Training without training. Knowledge forged from obsession and grief. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance only minutes later. Red and blue lights flickered across the snow-covered windows, while paramedics rushed inside with equipment. One medic immediately looked toward Ethan. What happened? Ethan answered clearly. Symptom timeline. Observations. Risk indicators. The medic's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. You in med school? Ethan hesitated for half a second. No, before the paramedics wheeled Dr. Bennett away, the older surgeon managed to open his eyes briefly. His gaze landed on Ethan standing beneath the library lights with soaked sleeves and tired eyes. You recognized it, he whispered weakly. Ethan swallowed once. My mother had similar symptoms. Dr. Bennett stared at him another moment before being rolled toward the elevator. The library remained completely silent after the doors closed. Rain hammered the windows. Somewhere near the front desk, a dropped pencil rolled slowly across the floor. Margaret looked at Ethan, standing motionless beside table 14. Then at the open neuroscience books, still waiting beneath the dim light. And for the first time, she realized the city had made a terrible mistake. Because the boy everyone overlooked had just saved the life of one of the most important doctors in Boston. 3 days after the incident in the library, Ethan assumed life would return to normal. He still woke beneath the overpass before sunrise. Still washed dishes at Murray's Grill until his shoulders ached. Still crossed Boston every evening with freezing wind cutting through his hoodie sleeves. But something subtle had changed. People looked at him differently now. The security guard near the front entrance no longer watched him with suspicion. Students who once ignored him now whispered quietly after recognizing him from the story spreading around campus message boards and hospital staff circles. The homeless kid who identified a stroke before the paramedics arrived. Ethan hated the attention. It made him uncomfortable. Dangerous, even. People noticed you before they disappeared you. So he kept his head down and focused on studying. That Thursday night, Margaret found him exactly where she expected. Table 14. 3 textbooks open. Pencil moving quickly across another page of notes. She approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Someone asked about you today," she said softly. Ethan barely looked up. "Who?" "Dr. Bennett's office." The pencil stopped moving instantly. Ethan raised his eyes slowly. Margaret sat across from him. Apparently, he remembers everything from that night. Ethan swallowed once. "Is he okay?" "Surgery went well. The doctors caught the bleed early enough." Relief crossed Ethan's face, so briefly most people would have missed it. Margaret did not. Before she could say anything else, footsteps echoed sharply through the aisle. Heavy, confident. Ethan looked up and froze. Dr. Richard Bennett stood at the end of the neuroscience section wearing a charcoal overcoat and hospital ID badge clipped near his collar. He looked paler than before, but his posture remained commanding. 2 younger doctors followed several steps behind him carrying folders. The entire library seemed quieter suddenly. Ethan instinctively stood up. Dr. Bennett studied him carefully for a long moment before speaking. "You are Ethan Walker?" Ethan nodded once. "Yes, sir." Dr. Bennett glanced down at the open textbooks covering the table. Advanced neurology, trauma response, surgical anatomy. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "How many hours a night do you study?" Ethan hesitated. "Depends." "That many, huh?" One of the younger doctors gave a faint, disbelieving laugh while flipping through Ethan's notebooks. "These are all yours." Ethan nodded again. The doctor looked stunned. "This is first-year medical level." Ethan lowered his eyes immediately, uncomfortable with praise. Dr. Bennett pulled out a chair slowly and sat across from him. "Margaret told me you taught yourself." "Mostly." "And where exactly are you attending school?" Silence. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the pencil. Dr. Bennett noticed instantly. So did Margaret. Finally, Ethan answered quietly. "I am not." One of the younger doctors frowned in confusion. "Not enrolled anywhere?" Ethan shook his head once. The aisle fell silent except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Dr. Bennett leaned back slowly, studying the exhausted teenager in front of him more carefully now. The worn backpack. The cracked knuckles. The hoodie sleeves still damp from melted snow. Then his eyes landed on the photograph beside Ethan's notebook. "Your mother?" Ethan nodded. Dr. Bennett looked at the image for a long second before speaking again. "You saved my life because you recognized symptoms nobody else in that room understood." Ethan looked down immediately. "I just remembered what happened to her." Dr. Bennett's voice softened slightly. "No, you remembered because you learned." Another silence settled between them. Then Dr. Bennett reached inside his coat pocket and placed a white business card gently onto the table beside Ethan's notes. "St. Vincent Medical Center, Department of Neurosurgery. Be at my office Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, he said calmly. Ethan stared at the card, without touching it. "Why?" Dr. Bennett's expression remained unreadable. "Because I would like to find out what happens when someone with your mind is finally given a real chance." Saturday morning arrived cold and painfully clear, the kind of Boston winter morning where every breath felt sharp inside your lungs. Ethan stood across the street from St. Vincent Medical Center, gripping the business card so tightly the edges had bent slightly in his pocket. Ambulances moved steadily beneath the hospital entrance canopy. Doctors in navy scrubs crossed the lobby carrying coffee cups and patient charts. Everybody looked like they belonged there. Everybody except him. Ethan glanced down at his reflection in the glass doors before stepping inside. Clean hoodie. Cheapest black pants he could find at a thrift store. Sneakers still cracked near the soles. He suddenly became aware of every detail about himself all at once. The scar near his wrist from washing dishes. The backpack strap tied together with a shoelace. The fact that he had spent the previous night sleeping behind a church because the overpass flooded during the storm. A woman at the reception desk smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Ethan hesitated before sliding Dr. Bennett's card across the counter. "He asked me to come." 10 minutes later, Ethan sat rigidly in a leather chair outside the neurosurgery department, trying not to stare at the framed medical degrees covering the walls. Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Stanford. The names alone felt expensive. Through the glass corridor ahead, surgeons moved quickly between operating rooms while monitors beeped softly in distant patient bays. Ethan watched everything carefully. The pace, the communication, the precision. This world felt terrifying to him. But it also felt strangely familiar, like the place his mind had been trying to reach for years before his body ever could. "Mr. Walker?" Ethan looked up quickly. Dr. Bennett stood nearby holding a tablet beneath one arm. "Come with me." Ethan followed him through a maze of bright hallways until they entered a private conference room overlooking the city skyline. Snow rested across rooftops beyond the glass. Dr. Bennett motioned toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Ethan obeyed quietly. Dr. Bennett opened one of Ethan's notebooks on the table between them. Pages filled with anatomy sketches and emergency procedures spread beneath the overhead lights. "You wrote all this without formal training?" "Yes, sir." "No tutor?" "No." Dr. Bennett leaned back slowly, studying him again with the same careful expression from the library. "Do you know what the average medical student spends preparing before entering neurosurgery?" Ethan shook his head. "Years," Dr. Bennett said calmly. "Most still struggle under pressure." He tapped one of Ethan's notes with his finger. "But you already think clinically." Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Compliments still made him uncomfortable. They felt temporary. Dangerous. Dr. Bennett noticed. "Tell me the truth," he said quietly. "When was the last time you slept in a bed?" Ethan froze. Silence filled the room. Outside the glass wall, snow drifted slowly over Boston. Finally, Ethan answered softly, "I do not remember." Dr. Bennett looked away for a brief moment, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Then he stood and walked toward the window. "Do you know why I became a surgeon?" Ethan shook his head. "Because when I was 26, my younger sister died from a condition we could have treated if someone had recognized it sooner." He turned back slowly. Sometimes grief does one of two things to people. It destroys them, or it gives them direction. Ethan remained perfectly still. Dr. Bennett walked back to the table and placed a thick folder in front of him. Ethan looked down in confusion. GED enrollment forms, scholarship applications, housing assistance documents, a hospital mentorship recommendation already signed at the bottom. Ethan stared at the papers like they were written in another language. "Sir," his voice cracked slightly before he stopped himself. Dr. Bennett's tone stayed firm but calm. "You still have an impossible road ahead of you, Ethan. Medical school will not care where you came from. It will only care whether you survive it." He paused briefly. "But for the first time in a very long while, I think you might." Ethan looked down at the signed recommendation letter again, unable to speak. And for the first time since his mother died, hope stopped feeling like something dangerous. 12 years later, the sound Ethan Walker heard most often was not applause, not praise, not even the steady rhythm of surgical monitors inside operating rooms. It was pages turning. Even now, after magazine covers and medical conferences and patients flying across the country just to be treated by him, some part of his mind still lived beneath the fluorescent lights of Table 14. St. Vincent Medical Center looked different from the inside now. Nurses greeted him by name as he crossed the surgical wing before sunrise. Young residents straightened nervously when he entered conference rooms. Hospital executives quoted his research during fundraising galas. Dr. Walker is one of the leading neurosurgeons in the country. Ethan never quite knew what to do with sentences like that. Because every morning, when he tied the strings of his surgical gown behind his back, he still remembered sleeping beneath train tracks while memorizing anatomy diagrams from discarded library books. Some memories never left your body. They just learned how to sit quietly beside success. The winter storm outside intensified as Ethan reviewed the brain scans glowing across the conference room monitors. The aneurysm sat dangerously close to critical vessels. Complex. High risk. One mistake could change everything. Around the table, senior surgeons exchanged tense observations in low voices. The swelling is progressing faster than expected. Surgical access will be extremely tight. We may not have another window if we wait. Ethan listened silently, arms folded across his chest. Then the final scan appeared on screen beside the patient file. Margaret Hale, age 64. Ethan stopped breathing for half a second. The room around him suddenly felt very far away. Dr. Collins, head of surgery, looked toward him carefully. You know the patient? Ethan stared at the scan without answering immediately. Somewhere deep inside his chest, an old fear woke up all at once. Not again. Not someone else I cannot save. He remembered Margaret. Sliding sandwiches across library tables without embarrassing him. Leaving books beside his notes. Turning off the lights so he could sleep without being noticed by security. He remembered her voice the night she asked him if he had eaten. Small kindnesses. Tiny moments most people would forget. But lonely people never forgot kindness. It became part of their survival. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. She is family. Silence settled across the room. Outside the conference windows, snow covered Boston in white stillness. Dr. Collins nodded slowly. Then you should know there are serious risks. Ethan looked back at the scans. I know. 3 hours later, the operating room lights reflected sharply against polished steel instruments while machines beeped softly around the surgical table. Ethan stood at the center of the room in navy scrubs, gloved hands perfectly steady despite the storm inside him. Around him, the surgical team waited silently for instructions. Begin. Hours passed beneath bright surgical lights and absolute concentration. Every movement precise. Every decision measured in millimeters. Ethan barely noticed the exhaustion creeping into his shoulders. He only saw the monitors, the vessels, the fragile line separating recovery from loss. At one point, a younger resident beside him whispered nervously, "How are your hands still this steady?" Ethan never looked up from the microscope. Because somebody once believed I could do this before I did. Nearly 11 hours after surgery began, the final monitor readings stabilized. The tension inside the room released all at once like a held breath finally escaping. One nurse quietly wiped tears from beneath her mask. Ethan stepped back slowly from the operating table, exhaustion crashing into him for the first time all day. But before leaving the room, he reached into the pocket inside his locker nearby and pulled out something old and worn, carefully protected inside clear plastic. A faded Boston Public Library card. The first card Margaret Hale had ever made for him. Under occupation, the words still remained in faded ink. Student. Margaret opened her eyes just after sunrise. Soft winter. Lights spilled through the hospital blinds, painting pale gold lines across the blankets while monitors beeped steadily beside her bed. For a few seconds, everything felt distant and blurry. The smell of antiseptic. The low murmur of nurses outside the room. The ache behind her eyes. Then she saw someone sitting quietly beside the window. Ethan looked older now than the exhausted teenager who once hid beneath library tables after midnight. The sharp edges of survival had softened over the years, replaced by calm confidence and tired kindness. But some things had never changed. He still held books when he was anxious. Still sat with one foot slightly restless against the floor when deep in thought. Still looked at hospitals like places where promises mattered. Margaret blinked slowly. Did I make it? She whispered weakly. Ethan looked up immediately, relief flooding his face so fast, it almost looked painful. Yeah, he said softly. You made it. Margaret studied him quietly for a long moment before smiling faintly. You always did hate losing people. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, emotion tightening in his chest before he could hide it. He stood and carefully placed something small onto her blanket. The old Boston Public Library card protected inside clear plastic. Margaret stared down at it in silence. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the faded letters beneath the cracked laminate. Ethan Walker. Occupation, student. Margaret laughed softly through tears gathering in her eyes. You kept this. Ethan nodded once. It was the first place anybody ever wrote down who I could become instead of what I was. Silence settled gently between them. Outside the hospital windows, snow drifted slowly across Boston rooftops while the city woke beneath pale morning light. Margaret looked back at him carefully. I always knew you would become something extraordinary. Ethan shook his head softly. No, his voice stayed quiet. Honest. You became extraordinary first. You saw somebody everybody else walked past. Margaret looked away for a second, blinking back tears. I just gave you books and sandwiches. Ethan smiled faintly. Exactly. 2 months later, the grand ballroom at St. Vincent Medical Center filled with surgeons, donors, researchers, and reporters beneath glittering chandeliers and soft classical music. Large screens displayed architectural renderings of the hospital's new neuroscience education wing, while waiters moved through the crowd carrying champagne glasses and polished silver trays. Dr. Ethan Walker stood near the stage in a black suit that still felt unfamiliar on his shoulders. Across the room, Margaret sat at a reserved table beside Dr. Bennett, both watching him with quiet pride. The applause began the moment Ethan stepped to the podium. He paused for a second beneath the lights, looking out across the crowded ballroom. Doctors, executives, people who once would have walked past him without noticing. Then his eyes found Margaret, the same woman who once left sandwiches beside a frightened teenager hiding in a library. Ethan took a slow breath before speaking. When I was 17 years old, I believed the world only changed for people who were already important. The ballroom fell silent. I slept in shelters, under train bridges, sometimes inside a library because it was the only warm place open late at night. Several people lowered their eyes quietly. Ethan continued. Most people never noticed me, but one person did. The large screen behind him shifted suddenly. A photograph appeared. Table 14 inside the old Boston Public Library, empty except for a single lamp glowing beside scattered books. Margaret covered her mouth softly in shock. Ethan looked toward her. Tonight, St. Vincent Medical Center is proud to announce the opening of the Margaret Hale Learning Center for underserved students pursuing medical careers. The ballroom erupted into applause powerful enough to shake the glasses on nearby tables. Margaret sat frozen, tears streaming silently down her face while every person in the room rose to their feet around her. Ethan smiled through the emotion tightening his own throat. Because after all these years, the lonely boy beneath the library table had finally done exactly what he promised his mother he would do. He saved lives, and he made sure nobody chasing hope had to do it alone anymore.